So in the last class, we were discussing about the question as to whether animals have rights. We were not broadly discussing about the question of animals, legal personality or animals' personality, because that is a kind of legal question. But we are concerned about the broader question of whether animals have rights, because it's obviously when we talk in terms of rights, we say that persons can have rights. Okay. But because of its very legal connotations, it makes sense to me that we talk in terms of animals as having rights. So yeah, we were discussing that question, okay, as to whether animals have rights or not. So we were about to discuss about two broad philosophical approaches to looking at this problem. Okay. Now we discussed that humans, by virtue of their their being born as humans, they are entitled to all the human rights, okay, which are out there because we are born human. And there are many reasons for why humans have these rights. Okay, we have discussed all this to a certain extent, and human dignity is quite often referred to, and so many other factors are there we have discussed. Now the question that we were struggling with was, why not extend the same to other non-human animals? So that's something that we were discussing about. Now, the question that arises is as to why should we consider them, or why should we not consider them the same way as we, consider humans as worthy of having rights? Why aren't they, why should we not consider them as, morally worthy? Okay, worthy of moral consideration. Now, to look at this problem, we have two broad approaches. One, you have that one that is the utilitarian approach. Then there is another approach that is the Kantian, rationalistic approach. Now, the difference between these two approaches are that when it comes to this approach, the utilitarianism, the approach of utilitarianism, it's based on certain calculation that we do. So basically, whether certain action is morally right or wrong is determined by the tendency of such action has of promoting happiness, okay, as opposed to pain. Okay, so if it has the tendency of maximizing happiness, then then you can say that that's something that's morally allowed, okay, morally justifiable. So that's the kind of approach that you take. So you look at the consequences of your action. Okay, what is the tendency of this particular action? If it has the tendency of promoting happiness, okay, with less sacrifice, okay, with less pain, then obviously that action is justified. So that's the kind of utilitarian calculation, okay, that one does in determining the moral justifiability of any particular action. As opposed to that, there is another approach which is little categorical in how it deals with these moral questions, okay, and that's developed by Immanuel Kant. Okay, now I do not have the time to discuss the whole thing, because that itself takes an entire semester if you're going to read them in details. But some aspects of it can definitely be introduced to you. So there are two principles, okay, which are important for us. Okay, so there are two maxims that Immanuel Kant's philosophy takes us to, and they basically tell us what we should do morally. Okay. So one is the two categorical imperatives that he lays down. The first one is the maxim that says that universalize your maxim, okay? And what does it say? It says that act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become universal law, okay? So what does it mean? So whether you should, act in a certain way or not, okay? Before you act, okay, you have to look at the justifiability of the act. And how will you look at the justifiability of the act? It says that act only in accordance with a maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it becomes a universal law. I mean, if I do it and if everyone, does that same thing, will that be, acceptable? Will that be possible? Okay. So that's one, okay. So, and then another maxim that is laid down is the maxim that says that treat persons as an end in themselves, not as a means to some other end, okay. So we are to act in such a way, okay, that we do not treat okay, rational beings, okay, and humans are considered as rational beings in Kant's account, okay, that we do not treat them merely as a means to certain ends, but as an end in themselves. So we are not to treat one as merely as an end in, as a means to certain ends. Quite often we do treat persons as means to certain ends. So that's not problematic. But you are not to treat, humans, they are rational beings, okay, merely as a means to certain end, but also as an end in themselves, okay. So basically what is said is that you do not treat humans as tools to achieve certain things. You have to also respect the fact that they are rational beings and that rationality has to be respected. Now this is very important for us. And in Kant's discourse, humans are the ones who possess rationality, and because they possess rationality, they are worthy of, of respect. Rational beings have dignity, and that is to be respected. Now, what about animals? Well, we'll deal with these two, that in a while. But let's start with the first, approach that I told you, the utilitarian approach of maximizing, happiness. Okay. So the utilitarian approach tries to increase happiness, okay, increase pleasure, and decrease and avoid pain, suffering, and all that, okay. So it's in our nature, we know what to do, okay. We tend to do, that we like, okay. So that which is pleasurable to us, that which, increases our happiness. So, and it is to be understood in a way. So, for example, sometimes when you exercise, okay, you go to the gym, you lift weight, or you run, whatever you do, one might say that, well, these are the times when people experience a kind of pain. I mean, you wouldn't consider that as a pleasurable experience. But then that's not how, it is to be understood, okay? Even then you get a sense of satisfaction, okay, out of it, okay. So that's the pleasurable experience of it. Although immediately it's the kind of, stress, it's the kind of, exertion that you have to, put. And that's definitely, not pleasurable. But then the experience in totality, okay, will definitely be understood in terms of, a pleasurable experience. So, yeah. So that's what, so you'd say that, well, any action that is taken will have the tendency of either increasing pleasure or increasing the pain. Okay, now whether we ought to do it or not. If the action has the tendency of increasing pleasure, happiness over that of pain, then it is justified. But if the tendency is that there is more pain but less happiness, less pleasure, then it is not justified. Okay. Now, the entire idea is based on this idea of pleasure and pain, okay. So that which increases pleasure is something to be done, that which has the tendency of increasing pain is something to be avoided, okay. So it does not give you any categorical idea of morally right action or morally wrong action. And hence, because these philosophers, unlike others, okay, other, in the previous class we discussed about many other reasons why animals are not considered as worthy of being considered as persons, or for that matter, rights. Okay, they talk about many different, characteristics that animals, do not possess, and hence they are not worthy of being considered as, persons, or as worthy of having rights. Okay, so for example, are they capable of complex thoughts like humans? Are they capable of communicating the way as humans do? And do they have the same different layers of consciousness and all that? Okay, maybe they do not, maybe in certain other animals they do. Okay, but for utilitarians, all those factors do not matter. Okay, the only thing that matters for utilitarians, because they're concerned about pleasure and pain. Okay, they ask the simple question: do animals feel pain? Do they suffer? So I quoted the para as was there in the reading that I had shared with you, that the pertinent questions are not that whether they can reason, whether they can talk, but whether they can suffer, as was asked by Bentham. So even though Bentham would ordinarily, anyone wouldn't associate as having talked in terms of rights of animal, but that's the natural conclusion that it takes you to. Animals are capable of suffering. They can feel, feel in the sense of they can feel pain, okay? And they're also able to feel pleasure. So if they are, then our actions have to take into consideration their pain and pleasure as well. If what we do has the tendency of increasing their pain, suffering, then that is something that we should avoid. So that's the conclusion that you can, at the outset come to, that why should we consider animals, here in our discussion relating to whether they ought to be treated in a certain way or not. Okay, you can, although it doesn't make much sense to talk about rights in utilitarian sense, but we can nonetheless use it in a different sense, in a lighter sense, whether they are worthy of being considered as having rights. Well, they are. Why? Because they're capable of suffering. They're capable of feeling pain. Similarly, the other philosopher that another contemporary utilitarian is Peter Singer, and he also talks about the same idea. Okay, you have the entire book to you. Okay, their idea is the same, that why should we treat them in a certain way and avoid treating them in a certain way? And that's simply because they are capable of feeling pain the same way. And the sensation of pain, the one's capacity of sensing pain is not to be taken lightly. That's what the position is. Okay, so why are we not to discriminate between humans and animals? Well, both these creatures, okay, both these animals, okay, we are also animals, as much animals, okay, are capable of the same pain, okay, and we are capable of pleasurable experience. So hence there is no morally justifiable way to exclude from moral consideration non-humans or non-persons who can clearly suffer. So you consider them in the legal sense as persons or not, okay, different thing, but they are definitely worthy of moral consideration. So, and then further says, any being that has an interest in not suffering deserves to have that interest taken into account. So yes, they the moment you hurt them, they react in a certain way. They squirm, they run away, they cry, okay, so they have an interest in not being hurt, not being inflicted with pain, okay. So that's the reason that we should consider them in our moral calculation. Now, whether that leads to the same idea of animal rights as many rights activists suggest is a different question that we have to address, and I left that unaddressed in the previous class. Okay, so you will see that there is another quotation provided here, okay, by here Korsgaard. It is a pain to be in pain, and that is not a trivial fact. Okay, our action should be the one that reduces suffering. Okay, that's what morally right thing to do. And then the same applies not merely to pain and suffering of humans, but also to that of animals. Now the thing is, let's take, for example, a simple example that can tell us, okay, we love eating meat. Not everyone, but many of us love eating meat, okay? You have a pleasurable experience from that, okay? But overall, imagine the suffering that, animals have to, undergo, because you slaughtered them, the physical pain, then psychological and many other pain that they have to endure, okay? And the fact that there are so many industrial scale, meat producing, factories, etc., okay, where from since the moment they are born till the time they are slaughtered and turned into, meat for human consumption, they undergo a lot of suffering, okay? And then that's there, okay? So they have a lot of suffering that they undergo, and at the same time, it's all done because humans love the taste of meat. So if we are to calculate this, okay, overall, pleasurable experience that humans have from consuming meat, and then balance that with all the suffering that animals have to, go through, then the balance clearly is in favor of us not eating meat, okay? So that means that, yes, you can broadly, okay, whether you can precisely come to that conclusion is a different thing, but it's quite understandable that, yes, the experience of pain is much more than the pleasure that we get from eating meat, because we can survive eating, other food as well. We can survive on, protein is important for us, but there are plant-based sources of protein as well that doesn't involve suffering of animals. So it is morally required now that we give up that much of pleasure, because for that pleasure certain other beings, okay, other animals have to undergo much more pain. So the balance is in favor of us not eating meat and considering animals as having same right. Animals as having the right of not suffering here, as I may put it lightly here. So yes, the quotation here further goes on that when you pity a suffering animal, it is because you are perceiving a reason. An animal's cries express pain, and they mean that there is a reason to change its conditions, and you can no more hear the cries of animal as mere noise than you can the words of a person. Another animal can obligate you in exactly the same way a person can. Person here is being referred to humans. So of course we have obligations to animals. Although here the reason and the emphasis is on reason, because Kierkegaard is a Kantian philosopher, but then you see the importance of pain. You cannot ignore the aspect of pain and suffering that animals go through. So yes, that's why we need to, so that's the simple explanation why we need to consider animals, moral claims, because they are capable of suffering, and we, as the principle of utilitarianism suggests, ought to take their suffering seriously. However, the problem is that utilitarianism need not take you to the, do utilitarians talk in terms of animal rights? Well, not really, because the idea of rights, as we traditionally understand, is not something you get from utilitarian calculation, okay? What if, for example, if once you did the calculation, the, conclusion is that, the happiness is increased if we consume meat, okay, if we kill an animal, okay, for consumption. What if that is the conclusion? What would we say then? Are we going to say that animals have rights, and even if the action has the tendency of increasing pleasure, we should not kill animals, okay? Well, if you apply utilitarianism, you cannot arrive at that, that conclusion. So that's basically the problem with utilitarianism. One example would tell you, okay. So there is this case, I forgot the name, but the names of the the individuals concerned here. I think the case of Richard Parker, if I remember it vaguely. Okay, you might have studied that in law of crimes, in IPC as well. Okay, so whether necessity can be a justification. So what happens is that some people were traveling in the sea on their ship, and then suddenly it meets with some mishap, and then the ship capsizes, and then there are these 4 people who are on a lifeboat. So they survive on whatever they had, and they catch fish and all that, but after that their health starts deteriorating. And one boy, young boy, I think his name is Richard Parker, who had very little chances of surviving, and these 4 other crews had to decide on whether they should kill this child so as to survive. Okay, so it's a case of extreme necessity. Now so I'm probably not telling you the exact details here, but it doesn't really matter. The thing is whether killing that child in that situation, where if they do not, then they definitely die, okay, is justified or not. If you take a utilitarian approach to this problem, the outcome is that, well, we have to do a moral calculation. In that case, the child did not have many relatives, and they didn't have much dependents, okay, who would need the child to be alive and all that, okay. Whereas these other people had their families, they had their dependents, and so if you did all the calculation, then obviously all of them dying would be worse than that child dying, okay. So it would be justifiable for them to kill the child, okay, for their own survival, because that action would have the tendency of increasing the happiness of the others, whereas the other option would be all of them die, the possibility of all of them dying. Now so lots of things happen, so eventually they end up killing the child, and then they are found by another ship, and then later on they are tried in court, which finds them guilty, and then says that even this worst necessity would not justify human killing. What is that? What is the reasoning provided here? That no amount of necessity would be justifiable in killing another human being. It's not justifiable in any way. So if our reasoning is like that, you see that humans are treated in a special way because they are rational beings. Whatever is the reason, they are humans. No amount of utilitarian calculation would justify that. Okay. In fact, anyone who's asked this question, unless they are in fact in that situation, obviously if people are in that situation, you never know how it may compel you to decide in such a scenario. But then, the general understanding is that, well, it is not justifiable it's not justifiable for you to kill another human being, even for your own survival. So you see that we are talking about inherent moral worth of human being when we say that it is never justifiable for humans to kill another human being, even if it means your own survival. But that's not the kind of rationale that we see in utilitarianism. So utilitarianism is not talking about inherent moral worth of animals. It's not saying that. It's merely saying that we have to do that which has the tendency of reducing pain, suffering. So if that's the case, then it's okay for us to kill animals as long as they do not suffer. Okay, as long as they do not suffer. So we can kill animals if they do not suffer. So if you grow the animals not in those close confined industrial scale meat producing factories, no, but if you produce them in free range open farms, and then you kill or slaughter them without any pain. So in Europe you keep hearing about this humane treatment of animals, why halal meat should be banned, and all those questions come up quite often. in all those instances, the idea is this, that yeah, meat's consumed, but we have to employ a human way of killing animals, something that has the tendency of reducing this pain, the suffering. So if that's the case, then if they can be killed, without them suffering, then it seems to be justifiable. If you take the utilitarian approach, but that's clearly not compatible with the vegetarian or the vegan claim that animals should not be killed at all, that they are to be treated the same way. As we talk about humans as having rights, animals are to have the rights in the same way. So that's the problem that we have. So how do we deal with such situation? So in such situation, animal rights advocates would use the Kantian, categorical imperative, if you remember, and whereas Immanuel Kant applies it to humans, he considers humans as rational beings, and hence worthy of dignity. And if they're worthy of dignity, we are not to treat them merely as a means to certain ends, but as an end in themselves. So if we are to treat human beings not merely as an end in themselves, not merely as a means to certain ends, but as an end in themselves, so in no situation would it be justifiable for us to kill them for our own survival, for our own pleasure. So when it comes to animal rights, they just extend it to animals as well. So animal rights position is to treat animals not as a means to certain other ends, so basically certain human end, that is consumption, or other form of animals abuse that happen, but as an end in themselves. So it is never justifiable for us to treat animals for consumption, or for that matter other forms of animal cruelty, abuse that happens. So for example, experimentation on animals. So it's never justified. So here you see that Tom Regan talks about animals are treated routinely, systematically, as if their value are reducible to their usefulness to others. Now usefulness is basically that what Kant talks about. You're treating them as a means to certain ends. You're treating them as objects. You're treating them as tools. But they ought not to, because they are worthy of moral consideration. Whereas for Immanuel Kant, say that only humans are rational beings, and because of that only they are worthy of dignity, and because of that only they are to be treated that way. But animal rights, when it comes to animal rights, those who talk in terms of animal rights, they extend it to animals as well. So that's the idea. So when it comes to animal rights, those who truly talk in terms of animal rights, are not really taking an utilitarian position. They're taking a much more firm and absolute position that animals are worthy of the same respect as humans do. Now why is that? Well, it cannot be merely suffering pain. Because if that's the case, if you are able to kill animals without them suffering, then that seems to be justifiable. But that's not the position which is taken. But utilitarian principle nonetheless is an option that we have that is able to reduce animal suffering to a great extent. So all these sports that involve treating animals in a cruel way for human enjoyment are not justifiable. So all these sports that involve, for example, in Spain they have these practices, and it's everywhere. Even in India you can also talk about jallikattu or whatever. It's not justifiable. Slaughtering animals for consumption, obviously not justifiable in any way. Because it involves pain. However, if you remember, utilitarianism also says that if you are able to do the same without inflicting pain, so human killing, so basically a headshot or whatever other means that involves no suffering for animals, or that involves painless death, then that seems to be fine. So that would mean that All industrial scale, animal farming and all those are not justifiable. Testing on animals will not be justifiable. Many things that involve unnecessary suffering for animals, okay, would not be justifiable. Why is that? Because that has the tendency of increasing, pain, okay, over that of the pleasure that is derived out of it, okay. So that is what is the position. However, for example, we have this pandemic like situation where we need to produce vaccine, okay. To what? To save lots of human lives, okay. So if that involves some experimentation on few animals here and there, okay, so that seems to be the case that, well, it's justifiable because of the the extremeness of the situation. So the happiness, the pleasure that we derive out of the outcome of this experimentation is much greater than the suffering of these animals. So in those situations, it seems to be justifiable. But when animals are treated by cosmetics companies, okay, that's clearly not justifiable. People who wear fur coats, okay, it's clearly not justifiable. It's unnecessary. You can avoid that, okay, okay. The suffering of the animals much more than the fashion pleasure that you get out of it, okay. So all those are clearly not acceptable. So yes, there are many such other examples that can be taken up. Well, and the utilitarian approach is also able to account for, probably not perfectly, but is able to account for certain extreme cases, okay, where people have no other way but to survive based on only animal meat consumption. So if you were, for example, living in those in Mongolia, in those vast plains of Mongolia, there's nothing that you cannot survive merely on like plant-based diet. Same would be the case, for example, if you are living in the Arctic Circle, okay, if you are Inuits, you can not much plants or things like that grow there, and you cannot survive there without eating meat. Now, eating meat would involve killing animals, and if you kill animals, that involves the animal suffering, okay. That seems to be not justifiable, okay. So what do? We bring them all, we compel them all to come to the part of the land where other options are available. Well, that is criticized by many because it seems to be imposition of one culture over other. Now, can utilitarianism help us here? Well, to a certain extent, I think the entire calculation is not being done, but if you look at their specific problem, whether it is justifiable for this nomadic tribes or Inuits to kill the animal for their survival, well, if you do the calculation here, it seems that, well, the happiness of the lives of these people are definitely, their happiness is definitely much more than that one animal that they kill for their survival. So it seems to allow even those extreme situations, okay. However, as I told you earlier, that's definitely not something that animal rights activists would accept. In fact, this is something that I haven't heard in any discussion relating to rights of animals. Now you see that, well, the discussion could go on, but what I can tell you is that yes, utilitarianism as a philosophy definitely provides us this tools to justify our arguments for reducing animal suffering, but it does not talk about animals as having the right in the same absolute sense as we claim humans as having, okay. Now that approach comes from another philosophical approach that we have, okay. And what is that? And that is the Kantian approach, okay. Now what is Kantian approach? Kantian approach is simply this, that okay, all humans are rational beings, okay. Rational beings. Who are rational beings? The ones who are capable of reasoning. Now here's a kind of bias that we have, okay, that we consider as only humans as capable of rationalizing, okay. But maybe certain other animals are also capable of rationalizing, okay, but probably not to the extent that humans are, okay. But not all humans are rational all the time, okay. Not all humans are rational all the time. Humans are quite often irrational. Their actions are also irrational. But does that mean that they're not worthy of being treated with respect, with dignity? Well, in Kant's philosophy, it's their capacity of being rational is what is emphasized on. Okay. Unless they take away that, by their own actions. But until then, we definitely focus on their capacity of being, rational being. So, yes, rationality is what is important. Okay. Now, if rationality is all that we are concerned about, then it need not be restricted only to humans. Any other, being that is capable of being reasonable the way humans are will also be worthy of moral consideration. However, back in that time, it was thought, because of our lack of understanding, that only humans were capable of reason. Now, if we had, for example, tomorrow AIs or other beings, okay, who are capable of rationalizing, then definitely Kant would say that they are worthy of moral consideration. However, the problem is that not all humans are capable of, yes, not every human beings like, rational, but there are some who are not even capable of being rational in certain situation. So people with certain mental disorders, different, problems, they are not able to rationalize the same way as other humans would. Okay. So what about them? How do we consider them as worthy of, moral consideration? So there are examples of humans, someone who's in coma, a child, who's a newborn child, and people with diseased, mental conditions. Okay, they do not have this element of, rationality. Okay, what about that? Now that's something that we have to consider. Okay, so in those situations, we say that, well, are they potentially capable of rationalizing or not? One may say that yes, if they were in good condition, then they are potentially capable of being reasonable, beings. Well, if that's the case, then remember another problem that we had come across. Earlier we talked about whether a child in the mother's womb worthy of being considered, as considered for this moral, worthy of, having rights or not. Okay. Well, if potentiality is the argument, then it seems that, well, in that situation, they are to be treated, the same way as other humans are, because they are potentially capable of being a rational human being. Obviously, later, not at this stage. So that's the problem that we have. So there are lots of things that we have to consider here. Oh, well, now the thing is this, that, well, if one is capable of being rational, then obviously they are to be considered not merely as a means to certain ends, but as an end in themselves. That means they have rights, they are entitled to rights. Okay. Now animals are not considered as not being rational. Okay, as humans are considered as being rational. As I told you, back in those times, the idea was that only humans are somehow different. They have their consciousness is different from, that of other animals. There's no denying that either. Okay, probably other animals do not have the same level of consciousness, okay, as humans have. And it is not merely consciousness that we are concerned about, and hence your capacity of reasoning. And I think there is a direct connection between the level of your consciousness and your capacity of reasoning. If you're not conscious of the world, okay, then you will not be able to reason. So there definitely is a connection between these two. So when it comes to human, sentience and human, consciousness, so there are different layers of that consciousness that is possible. So some animals are concerned about their immediate pleasure. Do I get food? Okay. Do I get to, reproduce? All those might be their concerns. But you see, when it comes to humans, humans are not driven purely by such desires. Okay, they're able to suspend such desires and also look for something else. Okay, they're able to think about the consequences of their actions. Okay, and that's what makes them rational beings. Okay, and because they are rational beings, they're worthy of being considered morally. That's the idea of morality here. Okay, of humans' special position. However, as we discussed, okay, the other day, there are many scientific inquiries that have been done that points to the fact that many higher apes are capable of rationalizing, maybe not to the same extent as humans are, but they are in fact capable of. Now let's assume that they are not capable of, okay, rationalizing the way humans are. Now what does that mean? That means that they are not to be considered as having rights. Well, from the Kantian perspective, you cannot, because they are not rational beings. However, that does not mean that every treatment of animal in whatever cruel way is justifiable. So how can we come to that conclusion though? Well, that would be that, well, we as rational human beings ought not to treat animals in a certain way. Okay, we ought not to treat animals in a certain way. And if we do, then we lose our humanity. It's not because they're rational and worthy of moral consideration. Not that. They are animals. Okay, that's there. But we are more than mere animals. We are rational creatures. So our treatment of animals cannot be how animals treat other animals. Okay, we definitely have to be rational in how we treat animals. So that's a way out that you can have from this paradox that we see here. Okay. Now the problem here is that in such situation, it does not really make much sense to say that we are talking about animal rights. Definitely not. It's talking about duty that humans have. It's not talking in terms of animals as having rights. Okay. So quite often when we say that animals ought not to be treated this way or that way, we say that because we consider those animals as having rights. Okay, the same could be applied even to humans, that there are humans who are not capable of being rational at a certain time. For example, if they are in coma or if they are infants. Okay, would that mean in such situation we do whatever we want to? Well, Kant would say no. Why? Because he would say that, well, it will decrease our own humanity. Okay, but in such situation, are we saying that these humans do not have rights? Well, not that. Okay, we are saying that they have rights. We do not say that because it has the effect of reducing our humanity, that we do not treat them in a certain way. So the Kantian approach is not really giving us a very satisfactory response here. Okay. So there are many other ways out which are suggested. Okay, you can have a look at them. Okay, so for example, Tom Regan's argument is there. Okay, says that what is important for moral consideration are not the differences between humans and non-humans, but the similarities. So we should look, instead of the differences that we are more rational, they're less rational and all that, we should instead look at the similarities. So he argues that because persons share certain with non-persons, with certain non-persons, obviously not, because you will not treat amoeba and other mollusks, etc., the same way as you would treat humans. But then okay, I should not generalize here. When it comes to cephalopods, they have been observed to have shown remarkable capacity, okay, of decision making. So recently I have heard of this experimentation on, I think, octopi, that they are able to pass a test that even human toddlers sometimes fail. Okay, that is of deferred enjoyment. So we have to do such, have to observe more, experiment more to be able to say things for sure. So yes, here Regan says that, because persons share with certain non-persons, which includes those humans and non-humans, have a certain level of organized cognitive function, the ability to be experiencing subject of a life and to have an individual welfare that matters to them, regardless of what others might think, both deserve moral consideration. So saying that, well, we do not look at differences, we look at the similarities. Why is that? You see, even among humans there are lots of differences. Okay, so if we go by that logic, okay, of pure rationality, it seems that eugenics is not really that problematic. Okay, so we have to look at the similarities rather than the differences. So he suggests, okay, argues that subjects of a life, okay, says that want and prefer things, believe and feel things, recall and expect things, and all these dimensions of our life, including our pleasure, pain, our enjoyment, suffering, our satisfaction, frustration, our continued existence, or our untimely death, all make a difference to the quality of our life as lived, as experienced by us individuals. As the same is true of animals, they must be viewed as experiencing subjects of a life with inherent value of their own. So yeah, it's based on these similarities, okay, on all these counts, okay, on all these categories, that they ought to be treated the same way as we treat humans. There is another view given by Korsgaard, okay, and Korsgaard maintains that there is a big difference between those with normative rational capacities and those without. But unlike Kant, okay, believes both humans and non-humans are proper objects of our moral concern. So here, the idea is that it is us, the humans, okay, who are having this discussion about whether animals ought to be considered in that, considered for rights, okay, whether they have any moral value. It is not the animals who are having this discussion. So that normative way of thinking is something that is restricted to only humans because of their rational capacities. And that's why the argument is that this idea of categorical imperative, second categorical imperative that Kant talks about, is applicable only to humans. But as opposed to that, Korsgaard argues that no, we need to consider even non-humans as the proper objects of our moral concern. Okay, so she argues that those without normative rational capacities share certain natural capacities. So maybe they do not have more normative capacity, but they definitely have natural capacities, with persons, and these natural capacities are often the content of moral demands. So it is those natural capacities that are the determining factor. So what are those? So she says, what we demand when we demand recognition is that our natural concerns, the objects of our natural desires, interests, and affections, be accorded the status of values that must be respected as far as possible by others. And many of those natural concerns, the desire to avoid pain, is an obvious example, spring from our animal nature and not from our rational nature. So see, here's a philosopher who's Kantian in many different degrees, but still referring to this urge of avoiding pain, okay, which is something that utilitarians talk about, but they're not, here's someone who's not doing that utilitarian calculation, but saying that because animals have this desire of avoiding pain, we should have moral consideration for them. So that's what has been said. But see, at the end of the day, the problem remains if you think about it clearly. So if it is pain, okay, if it is the pain that we are concerned about, what if we could kill the animals without afflicting pain? Well, in such situation, you will say that, well, they are worthy of innate, respect. And why are they worthy of innate respect? Well, they are capable of rationalizing, they are capable of reason. Well, then someone who's Kantian in approach will say that, well, no, they are not capable of rationalizing the same way as humans do. So that's why they are not worthy of being considered, of being considered for this, moral reasons. So that's the problem. We do not have, maybe someone amongst you can come up with a good, answer to that. We are in need of that. But the idea is that maybe we do not have a fixed solution here, okay, regarding animals suffering. But I think utilitarianism takes us far enough. The reality of the world is that animals are suffering a lot, okay. Now, even if we have to talk about animal rights in terms of this utilitarian approach, that in itself would be a great jump, okay. So if we could, for example, avoid unnecessarily animal suffering, that's a good step, isn't it? So yeah, all sports that involve cruelty to animals, let that be banned. All So yeah, when we treat animals, okay, use animals for very labor intensive activities, that's something that should not be done, to avoid suffering of animals. Industrial scale farm and animal meat production and meat farms are to be avoided, because that involves unnecessary harm to animals. It is only in those situations where it is necessary for our survival, okay, and it involves not much suffering for the animals, would it be justifiable for us to consume meat. So in those limited situations, it seems to be justifiable. So I think anyway, even utilitarian approach takes us far enough for us to really reduce the suffering of animals. Now, whether you call it animal rights in the animal rights activists in a sense, the way they use it, but then utilitarianism as a principle, as a philosophy, takes us far enough. Now, there are other thinkers that you will find who say that it is in no situation justifiable for us to treat animals in a certain way, and you guys can definitely go back and read them and watch videos. There are many videos available. Vegans, for example, they would in no way accept, for example, any form of consumption of animal product, not just meat but dairy product, eggs, whatever, okay. So I think one of you even have that as a project topic. So you can basically take off from this understanding that we have so far and develop your argument based on that. So I think that's enough with respect to rights of animals.